Good morning to all of us in here and everyone out there, and especially good morning to those watching at home in their pajamas. As you can tell, I've been struggling since Sunday with a virus, cold virus. But since this is the universal Christ, and Christ is a way of saying everything, that includes viruses. In fact, to take a phrase from Paul, Romans 16, viruses were in Christ before us. Long, long before us. As Mike said, these lectures are based on our book. Sarah and I work together. Sarah does photography, videography. I do the history and the theology. And both of us do travel, pedagogy, and fun. The book is really not a text illustrated by pictures. It is images commented on by a text. It is visual theology. And I'm not leaving biblical scholarship for art history. I want to know, for example, excuse me, if those 1 Corinthians chapter 15 said to Paul, you know, when you talk about crucifixion, we know what you're talking about. We've seen it. But, resurrection, could you draw us a picture of what it was like? If you were there, what would we have seen? Would Paul have drawn the Western vision of Jesus coming out all alone, triumphant, but very solitary? Or the Eastern vision of Jesus coming out with Adam and Eve, that is all humanity with him? Which would Paul have drawn? That is really my question. Now, we're working with videos. Each of my sessions will begin with a 15-minute video. And the title of the theme, as it were, is The Challenge of Jesus' Resurrection Today. The challenge of Jesus' resurrection today. That's the overall theme. And the sub-theme or subtitle would be this: how can Christianity's Easter vision change humanity's evolutionary future? What is Easter to do with evolution? That is the theme. And this morning, the first lecture, this is a change in your program, not because CAC made mistakes, but because we made changes. Forgot to tell them. Will be the historical Jesus and nonviolent resistance. The historical Jesus and nonviolent resistance. Now, before we start the video, which takes about 15 minutes, please understand, the video is not a visual aid. This is a visual aid. My glasses. The video is the thing itself, shown. Last night, Father Richard mentioned, translating, in the beginning was the Logos, by saying it was like a blueprint. That's a perfectly good, by the way, translation of Logos. Word is a little bit dangerously narrow. Did you ever try to describe a blueprint? You look at it, you see it, and you say, I got it. Took me a few minutes, but I got it. It's something shown. So the video you're going to watch now, in silence appropriately, is actually visual contemplation. That is the attitude with which Sarah and myself have created these videos. Visual contemplation. So 15 minutes then, and when you're ready, cue the video. I want to thank my beloved Sarah for that magnificent work and for the patience it takes. Thank you. If you're interested in the technology, what happened was way back in 1985 when we were making our first decisions. As in all major domestic decisions, we went to the Bible for guidance. We looked up PC and couldn't find it anywhere. And we found Apple 6 times. So this is done with Apple's magnificent keynote presentation technology. Actually, as we did further investigation, we came upon a prophecy in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 3, that warned that the days would come when those who looked through the windows would see dimly. It's actually all in the Bible. Our subject of the universal Christ, I want to be very careful, from my point of view, to hold on to 2 things, lest that becomes interpreted or understood externally especially as some form of new Christian imperialism or chutzpah merely. So I want to talk both of how this fits with evolution and how this fits with the historical Jesus. Fits, that wasn't a good word. How all of that holds together. Otherwise, I'm afraid that Christ might drift up into the air like some mythical phenomenon. So I want to start with evolution. And I love that word I used, matrix, because matrix, of course, comes from the same Greek and Latin root as mother. Mater, mater, Greek and Latin. So a matrix is a way of thinking of motherhood and the womb. So I use matrix of evolution, matter and energy, time and place, and then also for time and space, and also for Jesus, tradition, vision, time, and space. By the way, all creativity works with that matrix. Tradition is simply the way something is the way you're told it is. And then a vision is a way of upsetting that tradition. But time and place are equally important. If the time and place are not right, as we say, it will not happen. Think of Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell. Matrix is actually the diagram of his whole book. Tradition, vision, time and place, which simply mirrors the matrix of evolution itself. And for example, if we ever talk about love as a driving force of evolution, which we do, that's energy. What is the matter? It has to be justice. Otherwise, love becomes energy without matter. And I don't know physics well enough to say that can't be, but in my experience, you never have one without the other. So evolution, I want to start with. The Big Bang. If you think of the Big Bang, you can see 3 questions that arise. And these are not questions to be solved, questions to be answered, problems to be solved. They are really a mystery to be appreciated all the time. It's a mystery. The Big Bang and evolution proceeding from it is surrounded, grounded, encapsulated in mystery. Like last night when we saw that oil on the rock. If the rock is evolution, there's a mystery that surrounds it like the oil. And the mystery has 3 components. I'd put them as questions, but don't think there's answers. Why is there stuff? Why is there something rather than nothing? And granted there's going to be something, or there is something, why is it dynamic? Couldn't it be just static? And granted it is going to be static, why is it so just and fair? even to viruses, shall we say. That is the mystery that surrounds evolution, so that every time you're aware of anything that has to do with evolution, and I don't know how not to be aware of evolution, which means I don't know how not to be aware of the mystery that surrounds it, which I call God. I don't know how not to be aware of it. A second point. I tend to skip rather fast from the Big Bang, which is really beyond my comprehension, to be honest with you, to 70,000 years ago, when our species, Homo sapiens, came out of Africa. Our species. Sapiens, as you all know, is the Latin for wise. Somebody who named us had a great taste for oxymoron, or a lovely ironic sense of humor. But 70,000, think of Genesis 1, which we shouldn't take literally, but there's one thing in all of Genesis 1 that must be taken literally. Humanity is not the crown of creation. We are the work of a late Friday afternoon. Best work is never done on a Friday afternoon. Okay. Take that literally. Homo sapiens came out of Africa 70,000 years ago. And by 10,000 years ago, we were on every continent except Antarctica. And we had pretty busily eliminated any other Homo types that were out there and started again on the animals. I showed you Genesis 4, which is the most perfect short description of the Neolithic agricultural revolution anyone ever wrote. The farmer kills the herder and builds the first city. And as we know now, that the city will eventually, of course, kill the farmer. But what strikes me most about Genesis 4 is its awareness of, this is a hyphenated word for me, escalatory violence. Now, it really starts, it's supposed to be the first children, but we're really looking at tribal warfare. It doesn't know about our type of wars. It knows of tribal feuds. So it imagines Cain kills Abel. Won't Abel's tribe then exact sevenfold vengeance? No. God tries to stop the process. We wait in Genesis 4 for God to punish Cain. Oops, forgot punishment. And God marks Cain so nobody will do it, to stop this process. An aside, footnote. There's a legend. Came from people who figured Cain should have been punished. And the legend is that as he grew old and blind, Lamech, the one we saw later, he's an archer. You remember his bow and arrows there? And he's out hunting, and he hears a sound in the bushes, and he unleashes his arrow, and guess what? He kills Cain. Okay. But there is no punishment, because God is trying to stop this spiral of violence. And as you know, it doesn't work. Within 5 generations, Lamech is boasting, you hit me, I kill you. And sevenfold vengeance for Cain, 70 times 7 for me, from my tribe. What we have is the birth of escalatory violence in Genesis 4. Mesopotamia, as you all know, is where all of this was consummated by the birth of civilization. We call Mesopotamia, Iraq, modern Iraq, the cradle of civilization. but the hand that rocked that cradle was escalatory violence. That is the challenge of our species. Are we capable, not guided totally by instinct, but only by conscience? Remember, when we came out of the Garden of Eden, we had only one thing going for us: the knowledge of good and evil, or if you prefer, conscience. Can a species, guided only by conscience, not destroy itself? That is the challenge of evolution. Let me turn from evolution then to the historical Jesus. Father Richard said quite rightly that, of course, Christ is not the last name of Jesus, as if it was Mr. and Mrs. Christ's little boy Jesus. It's not his last name, but it is his first title. It is Jesus the Christ. But Jesus the Christ can't have Christ without Jesus. Could have Jesus without Christ, of course. Pilate was quite happy to have Jesus without Christ. Christ is actually the name for what happens when you commit your life to Jesus. Quite frankly, nobody should really use that name unless that's what they mean. It's quite all right to talk about Jesus. He's a historical figure. And if you imagine that on his desk, Pilate had a complete dossier on Jesus, everything he ever did, complete with videos and all the rest of it, he would have made exactly the same decision. Pilate actually, from his point of view, got it right. How else can you see it? Let me go back to that. If you only know one thing, about Jesus, and this is the most secure thing that scholars know about this historical figure, it is the most secure thing we can know about any historical figure. He was crucified. I want to cross out crucified because we've domesticated it too happily. He was executed. He was executed legally, formally, and publicly by the established power of his day. I showed you in the video how Rome operated. If you were a violent rebel, they grabbed you and as many of your major lieutenants, let's say, and they crucified you in a row. After the first war against Rome of 4 BCE, 2000 in Jerusalem. After the war of 66 to 74, in 70, Titus crucified 500 a day until he ran out of trees. But the way Rome handled non-violent resistance was to kill, publicly execute the leader. Don't bother with the people who followed him. If they're still around 5 years, then you do it all over again till they get the message. So if we only know one thing, that Pilate executed Jesus but didn't bother to round up his followers, then we know from Pilate's point of view, Jesus was leading unarmed, non-violent resistance to Rome. Two things. He would not have wasted a public execution, iron nails, and a squad of soldiers, expert executioners, unless Jesus was a public threat. But to crucify him alone, to execute him alone, meant that he was a non-violent one. Pilate got it right. I sometimes think, you know that story in Matthew's Gospel where Pilate's wife sends a message to him have nothing to do with Jesus. There's the biblical basis why husbands should obey their wives, actually. I often wonder afterwards, when Pilate went back to the private quarters, what did he say to his wife? Maybe something like this: "Don't worry, dear, what happens in Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem." Back to Christ. Let me read you the first two non-Christian authors who talked about the death of Jesus: Josephus and Tacitus. Josephus and Tacitus. You can catch the surprise as they tell why this didn't work. If we executed him, that was supposed to finish the movement. Why didn't it work? What's happening in these two accounts, they're not particularly interested in Jesus, but they're interested in explaining who these weirdo Christians are. And weirdo Christians are called after a Christ, like Aristotelians, Aristotle, Platonists, Plato. Christians called after Christ. Who's Christ? Okay? Josephus. Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified. Then the surprise, Josephus. Those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. It's a rather gentle, delicate admission it failed. Tacitus, who is a magnificent Roman snob, by the way, Christ had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And the pernicious superstition was checked for the moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in Rome itself, where everything rotten arrives eventually. Okay. What is important again, and I'm starting with this at the end of Jesus' life: he is executed for non-violent resistance to Rome. Rome did not crucify philosophers, even cynic philosophers or Stoic philosophers who criticized them. They executed what we would call activists. Activists. So if we know nothing else about Jesus, nothing else, but we do know a lot more. He was executed for non-violent resistance. Let me back up a little. I asked 3 questions in that video. Why did Jesus happen when he happened? Why is all of this earthquake, as it were, happening on the northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee in the 20s? Why then? Why there? It's a little like asking why Martin Luther King Jr. was on that bridge that afternoon. Because that was where the action was. That's where all this magnificent vision throughout the Torah and the prophets of a world of justice, a world of peace, a world without war, a world where people could sit under their own vine and their own fig tree and no one would make them afraid. That magnificent vision all comes down to a piece of real estate at a point in time. Remember the matrix, almost like a sign of the cross, right? Tradition, vision, time, place. Time and place are important. What is happening is Jesus is living in the Romanization of his homeland. Rome has arrived. And it's not that this tiny piece of land is so precious in its produce, but it does link Syria and Egypt, the 2 breadbaskets of the Roman Empire during the non-sailing season. So it's precious to Rome. But precious to Rome means that you must get with the program of Mediterranean globalization. What is happening in the first century is globalization. Limited, if you will, but to the Mediterranean and all the surrounding countries. Israel is being integrated into Mediterranean Roman globalization. The generation before Jesus, Herod, trying to get with the program, builds that mighty port at Caesarea. The port is called Sebastos, the Greek word for Augustus. The city is called Caesarea. Okay, we got it. Yeah. And on this magnificent port, with its opening towards the northeast, right as you came into the harbor, off the grid of the city was a shining white marble temple, one of the first in the whole Roman world, built to Roma et Augustus. The couple at the center of the New World Order. Herod was getting with the program. That's what he was put in to do, of course, Herod the Great. Put in to help Romanization. But that was the generation before Jesus. Then you come to the generation of Jesus. And round numbers say 0. I love that. I wonder that people worry about the Y0K, Y0K problem. Did anyone notice we were counting backwards before? Anyway, 0 to 30. Now, what's happening then is Romanization is moving north. Herod the Great operated mostly in the south. I mentioned Caesarea. He built a huge plaza of the temple, because you have to watch your Roman masters and your Jewish subjects. You have to please your Roman masters, but you can't so do it that you displease your Jewish subjects in their revolt, because that's the best way to become an ex-Roman king. His son, Herod Antipas. When you look at the history, I'm not going to say this was inevitable. You can never say that. But at least you can see why it happened. It's not mysterious, actually, why Jesus happened when and where he happened. It's just absolutely mysterious that he happened. Because we can never explain why this person and not all the others did what they did. But we can understand how they got traction. We can understand how a vision of justice and peace could find a local habitation and a name in the northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee in the 20s of the first century under Antipas. Because Antipas had only one idea in his mind. And I'm not reading his mind, I'm reading his actions. Antipas wanted to be King of the Jews, a title only Rome could give and had given to his father. You have one more son who wants to be as good as his father, which is always very dangerous throughout history. Antipas wanted to be king of the Jews. We know that for sure because he went off to Rome after Herod died, and there was explosions all over the Jewish homeland in 4 BCE. Antipas went off to become king of the Jews with Augustus's approval. And Augustus decided not to make anyone king of the Jews, but to divide up the country between Herod's sons. Herod, by the way, makes Henry VIII look monogamous and magnanimous. He had about 10 wives. I'm trying to figure out his family tree is like a bramble bush rather than a tree. But anyway, Antipas went off to become king of the Jews. He ended up not being made a monarch, a one leader, or an ethnarch, a people leader, but a tetrarch, a quarter leader. He must have come back with his tail very much between his legs, in charge of Galilee on one side of the Jordan and Perea on the other, not even connected to one another. But he had met Augustus, and you don't fool around with Augustus, so he stayed very, very quiet until Augustus died in 14 CE. Now, Antipas makes his move. Now, again, I'm interpreting here. But I'm interpreting in terms of what he did. The first thing he did was decide to move his capital city. I think you don't move your capital city unless you get an earthquake, which is a hint from God to move. So if you do that, you really annoy everyone. If I'm a high aristocrat in the court of Antipas at Sepphoris, what am I going to do with my used villa? For sale, one used villa, going cheap. Who wants to buy it? They're moving with the court. And if I'm with one of those small little poor little alley scribes who comes in from his farm every day, and he knows enough to write small contracts, and he does this, he can't move 20 miles. Everyone's going to be mad. And we know they were mad because they started circulating stories. He's built on top of a cemetery. All his palace is filled with images he shouldn't have. So he had to have a huge reason for doing it. Or he was an idiot. And he wasn't an idiot, because he ruled for over 40 years. So what's he up to? Now, you look at what his father did. He appeased the Romans by building this city. He appeased his Jewish subjects by the temple plaza, the giant temple plaza, 15 football fields. If I could up my tax base without alienating my peasants who are living at subsistence level, Rome would say, look what he did in Galilee, think what he could do with the whole country. I get it. I failed under Augustus, maybe under Tiberius it can work. So he moves his capital city, open for business around the year 20. He's going to commercialize the lake. He has already commercialized the lovely valleys around Sepphoris. He can't do much more there with peasants living at subsistence level, or he'd have a revolt, and then he will be an ex-tetrarch by evening. He's going to commercialize the lake. Now be clear, that's an interpretation. But it's an interpretation necessitated by what on earth is he up to? And then, of course, what on earth is John the Baptist and Jesus up to? Those questions, remember, everything was peaceful for over 25 years. What happened? And then you look at the pattern. All of the primary companions of Jesus, Mary of Magdala, she's identified, for example, by her own town. I would presume that Mary of Magdala was a very rich widow. Very rich widow. Magdala was the main fishing village on the lake before Tiberius was plunked right next door. You don't identify a person in the ancient time from their town unless they're fairly important in that town. And then Peter, of course, Capernaum. All of these seem to be fishers. That's why there's so much fishy stuff in the gospel. That's why the multiplication of the loaves is probably something like a political action, however you explain it, or even if it's a pure parable. You don't multiply the loaves and the fishes. I think in that whole story, the fishes are the point. Who's in control of the fish? Now again, as I said, don't say, oh, the whole thing is about fish. No, the whole thing is about who controls the world. But not in abstract, beautiful language like you may get from the prophets, but as it comes down to this piece of real estate. And it's a very good metaphor to think of earthquake, because, of course, the whole Jordan Valley is an earthquake fault. So the earthquake takes place on the northwest quadrant, because that's where the major fishing villages are, and they have all been the spoiled. And the dangerous people are not the street poor, actually. They're people who yesterday were able to take care of their families with a peasant farm, let's say, and protein supplement from the lake. But now they cannot even launch a boat without paying a tax, maybe. Or even have a boat, I don't know. And they probably have to sell their fish, if they catch it legally, to the fish factories that Antipas has set up, because he's not interested in selling locally. He's interested in salting his fish, drying his fish, sending it out through Tyre and Sidon into the Mediterranean globalization. I remember growing up in Donegal, used to be in the late 40s. You know, you could go down to the place where the boats came in, and you could buy a lobster right there. They were glad to sell it to you, very cheap. Now, if you did the same thing, it would be flash frozen, and you'd be paying the price of Paris that afternoon, probably. So all of a sudden, everything is happening around the lake. And please understand, the program that Antipas has is not to impoverish Galilee. Some people are going to do very, very well indeed in this procedure. Others are going to get much, much poorer. The rich in Galilee will be much, much richer because they're now integrated into the Mediterranean trade. They can sell their fish all the way to Rome if necessary. Dried and salted. That's why that boat is, for me, a sacrament. The boat was discovered in 1980. Now, it's only one boat. It doesn't prove anything. But it's the one boat we ever found. And everyone got so excited. This is the Jesus boat. This is the boat Jesus used to use. And then they discussed how many people could fit in it. And it got difficult because you'd have to figure who's walking on the waters and who's in the boat. And you couldn't really figure it out. Yes, this is the work boat. This is the boat we're imagining in the Gospel. It's the work boat of the Sea of Galilee in the first century. When it was discovered in 1986, I think, what had happened was the waters had receded in the drought, and there, between the shore and the waters out there, you could see the gunnels of a boat. You could see it right there. And as soon as it was found, actually, the waters were starting to rise. So it has been described as the excavation from hell, because it had to be sheeted in some sort of polyurethane something, and then floated over to be put into a vat of some kind of, again, chemical, I won't even try to remember, to get all the water out of that for 10 years, so this whole thing wouldn't fall apart. And today you can see it. Sarah saw it, and I saw it the first time in its vat, and then we saw it later in those pictures in the museum. I really look at it as a sacrament. This shows me, it's not because Jesus was in it. That's not the sacramentality. It's because this is the economics. This is the symbol of the economic squeeze for ordinary fishers on the Sea of Galilee. And this is the economic squeeze. This is the place in time and space and on this earth where the explosion happens. And again, it's like an earthquake. If you know everything, the variables, you know why this earthquake took place precisely here and precisely at this time. This is like a spiritual earthquake, as it were. And you can see the reason for it in that boat. When you look at it, it started as a good boat. It really was a good boat. And then it's patched with 10 different types of materials, some of it junk material. It's like looking at top-flight nautical engineers working with totally inadequate materials. It's like walking around Havana and seeing those cars, American cars from the 50s, and thinking, there must be magnificent mechanics in this city because they can keep it up. And then one day it wasn't possible. One day it was hopeless. They took off the stem post, the stern post, the mast, all the oars, and every iron nail pulled out of it. They were just pushed out of Magdalene, by the way, pushed off from the boatyard and sunk. Didn't sink in a storm. Just couldn't be nursed along anymore. So it was just sunk. Probably there's a graveyard of boats out there. So for me, it's a symbol. It's a sacramental symbol of the squeeze that gave John the Baptist first, and Jesus the traction to say, this is what our whole tradition comes down to. Who owns the world? Who runs the world? Is this the world of God or of Caesar? Let me conclude. I want to look at two parables in the gospel. I don't think either of them happened, but a parable means they never happened but are totally true. One is that story about Barabbas. We put it up there before as an example. In Mark's gospel, Mark wants you to have imagine Pilate with Barabbas, as it were, on one side and Jesus on the other side. And the giveaway that it's a parable is his title, Bar-Abbas, son of the father. Not really helpful to designate a male person. Most of them tends to be sons of the father and the mother, of course, but it's like if you went through Scandinavia and all you had were Joe father-son. Not going to be helpful. So that's a clue, be careful. So Barabbas is a rebel. He's a freedom fighter. He's a freedom fighter. From the Jewish point of view, he's fighting for their freedom violently. On the other side is Jesus, for Mark's gospel, the non-violent freedom fighter. And Mark wants to say, you made the wrong choice. Mark is writing after the Great Revolt of 66 to 74, when Jerusalem was destroyed because of armed rebellion. He wants us to look at the two options: violent revolt, non-violent revolt. And by the way, an aside, an important aside, I am not suggesting that Jesus invented non-violent resistance. In the lull between 4 BC and 66, which I mentioned, those armed revolts, there are all sorts of organized, non-violent resistance experiments recorded by Josephus. They're all there. In 6, at the time of 6 CE, at the time of the census when they were counted for taxation, non-violent revolt. 26 under Pilate, 2 accounts of organized, non-violent resistance. Organized. Groups just sitting down, refusing to move. And then 40-41, the winter of 40-41, when Caligula tried to put his statue in Jerusalem's temple, tens of thousands conducted a sit-down strike. They went to Petronius, who took his legions and the statue south. He knew what was going to happen. He was a decent Roman aristocrat. He was stalling like mad. Thousands of people came to his praetorium, sat down and said, you can kill us if you will. We're unarmed, but we're not going to go along with this. The War of 66 could have started as an unarmed protest in 41, except that Caligula was assassinated in Rome because he knew what Petronius was doing and was going to have him kill himself. All of that was there. What Jesus did was declare that non-violent resistance is the way the kingdom of God becomes incarnate on earth. He took that experience of nonviolent resistance, which is there in the Jewish tradition, all over Josephus. And I really wish, actually, that Jewish scholars and Christian scholars might read Josephus a bit more on that. Because we all know about the great revolts, but we forget about that. Okay. The other parable is that great story in John, which puts Jesus standing with Pilate. And he says to him, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my guys would be in here fighting to get me out." There you have it, Pilate. You're standing here, your troops are all around you. Where are my troops? The clearest line in John's Gospel, a Gospel not always known for clear lines, is that statement by Jesus to Pilate, a parable, I feel sure. "My kingdom is not like yours, not of this world. It is a kingdom that is a kingdom of nonviolence." Thank you very much.